The announcement hit like a thunderclap on a clear day, sudden, disorienting, and impossible to ignore. Shaquille O'Neal had cancer. The message he shared with the world was by all accounts deeply moving. It was not the polished product of a public relations team managing a crisis. It was the statement of a man who had been forced by the particular cruelty of internet speculation and the specific indignity of having his private medical situation become the subject of public rumor before he was ready to address it to speak sooner than he would have chosen. "I'm sorry that the immaturity of the internet forced you to speak," one supporter wrote on social media, articulating what thousands of others felt: the specific anger at a culture that treats celebrity illness as content that cannot allow a man to process a devastating diagnosis in the quiet of his own home and his own family before being required to perform that processing for public consumption. Shaquille O'Neal had wanted to handle this privately. He said as much in the video, the characteristic directness of a man who has never been particularly skilled at pretense, who has operated across his entire career with a transparency about his feelings and his opinions and his motivations that has sometimes gotten him into trouble, but that has also made him in a media landscape full of carefully managed personas, genuinely refreshing. He wanted privacy. He did not get it. And so he spoke. The response was immediate and came from the highest levels of the world he had occupied for 30 years. Snoop Dogg, whose friendship with O'Neal spans decades and whose cultural stature in the entertainment world parallels O'Neal's in sports, commented with characteristic economy and warmth, "Your strength is steadfast. I'm always thinking of you." Charles Barkley, O'Neal's colleague on TNT's Inside the NBA, and one of the few people on earth who can match his capacity for both genuine hilarity and genuine insight, sent his best wishes and a tribute to his friend's fighting spirit. "Thank you for the determination to fight for yourself and for everyone. Wishing you all the best." Others in his orbit, the vast community of people whose lives had intersected with O'Neal's across 30 years of being one of the most famous human beings on the planet, offered the specific kind of love that comes from genuine relationship rather than performance. We wish Shaquille health and a speedy recovery, and hope he can do it in peace and quiet. Peace and quiet. For a man who has rarely experienced either by choice or by circumstance, the idea of peace and quiet carries a particular weight. Shaquille O'Neal has lived his life loudly, joyfully, at a scale that few human beings achieve, and the idea of him navigating something as private and as frightening as a cancer diagnosis in the glare of public attention is in some ways the final act of a life that has almost never been allowed to be ordinary. But this is who he is, and understanding what it means for this specific man to face this specific challenge requires the full story. From the Newark housing projects, where he learned what it meant to be large and different, and to choose strength over victimhood, to the Louisiana and Georgia military bases, where his stepfather's discipline shaped the competitor beneath the entertainer, to the basketball courts, where he became one of the most physically dominant athletes in the history of any sport, to the recording studios and movie sets and boardrooms, where he built the empire that the basketball career financed. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal was born on March 6, 1972 in Newark, New Jersey, a city that was in the early 1970s still recovering from the devastating 1967 riots that had restructured its social geography and left permanent scars on its economic and civic life. Newark was a city of enormous contradictions, deeply impoverished in its residential neighborhoods, particularly the ones where Black families like the O'Neals were concentrated, and yet possessed of a cultural richness and a community resilience that the statistics of poverty never fully capture. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, was a teenager when Shaquille was born. His biological father, Joe Tony, was absent, a fact that O'Neal has discussed with varying degrees of emotion across the years, from the anger of a young man who felt abandoned to the more complicated understanding of an adult who has had to reckon with what that absence meant and how it shaped him. The relationship between O'Neal and his biological father has been one of the more publicly examined aspects of his private life, a wound that fame did not heal and money did not close. But the more consequential paternal figure in Shaquille O'Neal's life was not Joe Toney. It was Philip Harrison, an Army sergeant who met Lucille when Shaquille was still young and who became, through the specific mechanism of military discipline and genuine love, the father who shaped the man. Harrison was not a soft presence. He was demanding in the way that people who have been trained to military standards are demanding, precise about expectations, consistent about consequences, unwilling to accept the excuse of difficult circumstances when effort and discipline were available alternatives. For a boy who was growing at an extraordinary rate, Shaquille O'Neal would eventually reach 7 feet and 1 inch, weighing well over 300 pounds, a physical presence so overwhelming that it required the entire architecture of professional basketball to be reconsidered to accommodate it. The presence of a father who refused to allow physical size to become a substitute for character was perhaps the most important thing that could have happened. The family moved frequently, following Philip Harrison's military assignments to Germany, to various army bases across the American South and East. These relocations, which would have been disorienting for any child, were particularly complicated for a boy who was never going to blend in, who was always going to be the tallest person in any room he entered, who was always going to attract a particular quality of attention from the people around him. Shaquille O'Neal learned, in the process of these moves, how to enter a new environment and establish himself quickly, how to use the personality that was as large as his physical presence to turn strangeness into familiarity and potential hostility into something warmer. He learned basketball the same way he learned everything else, by competing, by failing, by being too large to be graceful, and gradually becoming large enough that grace was something he could develop, rather than something he needed to borrow. At Robert G. Cole High School in San Antonio, Texas, where Philip Harrison's military career eventually landed, the family Shaquille O'Neal became a basketball player in the full sense of the word. Not merely a large person who was useful in the paint, but someone with actual skills, actual competitive intelligence, actual understanding of the game that would have made him valuable even at a more conventional size. He was recruited by Louisiana State University, the Tigers of the SEC, coached by Dale Brown, who had tracked O'Neal's development with the obsessive attention that the best college coaches apply to the players who represent once-in-a-generation opportunities. Brown had, in fact, first encountered O'Neal when the teenager was in Germany with his father's unit, an extraordinary piece of basketball scouting that speaks to both the thoroughness of Brown's operation and the sheer impossibility of missing someone of O'Neal's physical dimensions. At LSU between 1989 and 1992, O'Neal developed into the most dominant college player in the country twice, named the SEC Player of the Year. His combination of size, strength, skill, and an improving understanding of how to use all of these attributes together, making him not just unmatchable, but genuinely fascinating to watch. He was not the ponderous, limited big man that the game had occasionally produced before the player whose value was entirely dimensional, whose contributions were a function of mass rather than basketball intelligence. He was something new, a player who was both enormous and skilled, both physically overwhelming and genuinely athletic. He left LSU after his junior year, which was in retrospect inevitable. The financial value of what he was about to become was staggering, and the NBA draft represented an opportunity that no reasonable calculation of self-interest could justify deferring. The Orlando Magic selected him with the first overall pick in the 1992 NBA draft. He was 20 years old, and the basketball world had been waiting for him for years. The impact was immediate. In his rookie season, O'Neal averaged 23.4 points and 13.9 rebounds per game, numbers that for a 20-year-old center in his first professional season were not simply excellent, but historically anomalous. The Magic were transformed overnight from a lottery team into a genuine contender. The NBA's entire defensive calculus had to be reconsidered. The question was not whether Shaquille O'Neal could play in the league. The question was whether the league had the tools to contain him. The years between O'Neal's arrival in the NBA in 1992 and his retirement in 2011 constitute one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of professional basketball. The statistics are almost numbing in their scale: 28,596 career points, 13,099 rebounds, 3,026 assists, 2,732 blocked shots across 19 seasons and 6 different franchises, a career scoring average of 23.7 points per game, a career rebounding average of 10.9. But the statistics, as always, tell only part of the story. The full story requires context, the specific moments and the specific rivalries and the specific partnerships that made O'Neal's career what it was. The partnership with Kobe Bryant at the Los Angeles Lakers, which produced 3 consecutive NBA championships between 2000 and 2002, and which was simultaneously one of the most productive player partnerships in basketball history, and one of the most complicated interpersonal relationships the game has ever produced, was the central drama of his prime years. O'Neal and Bryant were, in the most literal sense, made for each other. A center whose dominance in the paint freed up the perimeter for a shooting guard whose ability to score from the outside was unparalleled, and a shooting guard whose gravity from the outside forced defenses to spread in ways that made O'Neal's interior dominance even more complete. They were also, in the most fundamental sense, incompatible personalities. O'Neal was social extroverted, interested in the entertainment dimensions of his fame, unwilling to let the obsessive seriousness of a competitor like Bryant define the culture of the team. Bryant was intensely focused, sometimes consumed by competition to the exclusion of almost everything else, privately resentful of what he perceived as O'Neal's willingness to let conditioning and effort fall short of the maximum possible. The tension between them was creative. It produced 3 championships, and it was destructive. It eventually ended a partnership that, properly managed, might have produced many more. O'Neal won a 4th championship with the Miami Heat in 2006, alongside Dwyane Wade, in a finals that showcased a different dimension of his basketball intelligence: the elder statesman, the veteran presence, the player who understood that the best version of his contribution in this chapter of his career was to create the space for a younger partner to flourish, and who executed this understanding with the specific generosity of ego that only truly secure competitors can manage. The MVP awards, the All-Star selections, the All-NBA team nominations, the Defensive Player of the Year award, all of these formal recognitions were, in a sense, simply the institutional acknowledgement of something that anyone who had watched Shaquille O'Neal play understood intuitively. He was in his prime, the most physically dominant player the game had ever produced. And he had been intelligent and skilled enough to make that dominance sustainable across nearly 2 decades at the highest level. Behind the championships and the commercial endorsements and the entertainment career that O'Neal was building in parallel with his basketball dominance, there was a private life that was considerably more complicated than the public persona suggested. He married Shawnee Nelson on December 26, 2002. The marriage produced 4 children together. Sharif Amira Shakir and Miara and O'Neal also adopted Shawnee's son, Miles, from a previous relationship. On the surface, the picture was one of the family stability that his own childhood, disrupted by his biological father's absence, had made him determined to provide. He spoke about his children with a consistency and warmth that was clearly genuine. Fatherhood was, by his account, the thing he took most seriously, the responsibility around which everything else was organized. But the marriage was under pressures that fame and money and the specific dynamics of an NBA career, the travel, the attention, the proximity to temptation, the specific culture of celebrity that surrounds elite professional athletes, made difficult to sustain. Shawnee Nelson filed for divorce in 2009, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was finalized, and the family that O'Neal had been determined to provide for his children was reconfigured into the shared custody arrangements and the blended family complications that modern American divorce produces. He has spoken about the divorce with a candor that is unusual in the public discourse around celebrity relationships, acknowledging his own failures without excessive self-flagellation, without assigning sole blame to his former wife, without constructing the kind of self-serving narrative that the industry encourages. He made mistakes. The marriage ended. He loves his children. These are the facts stated without decoration, in the manner of a man who has learned that honesty about failure is more useful than its management. There were also the public romantic relationships that followed, most notably the long relationship with Nicole Alexander, and the subsequent engagement and split with radio personality Letitia Roll, each of which played out at least partly in the public view, and each of which contributed to an image of O'Neal's romantic life as something more complicated and less settled than the championship-winning certainty of his professional persona. What remained constant through all of these developments was his relationship with his children, particularly with Shaquille O'Neal, who followed his father into basketball and whose own career has been marked by the specific challenges of operating under a name that the sport will never allow to be ordinary, and with his other children, whom he has continued to champion and support with the full force of his attention and resources. In 1993, barely a year into his NBA career, Shaquille O'Neal released a rap album. Shaq Diesel, produced with a roster of collaborators that included DJ Alizé and Warren G, was not a vanity project, or not merely a vanity project. It was a genuine attempt by a 21-year-old with a personality too large for any single medium to contain to find additional outlets for the creative energy that basketball alone could not exhaust. The album sold more than 1 million copies. This fact is less surprising in retrospect than it might initially appear. O'Neal had, in addition to his basketball fame, a charisma and a sense of comedic timing that translated genuinely to the musical medium, and the mid-1990s hip-hop landscape was capacious enough to accommodate a basketball player who could actually rap rather than merely approximate the form. The music career was followed by a film career, most notably the 1996 science fiction action film Kazam, in which O'Neal played a genie, and the 1997 superhero film Steel, in which he played a DC Comics character of the same name. Neither film was a critical success, and both have become, in the years since, cultural reference points for ambitious projects that did not achieve their ambitions, which O'Neal has acknowledged with the self-deprecating humor that is one of his most appealing qualities. He tried. The films did not work. He moved on. What has worked with remarkable consistency is his television and media career. Inside the NBA, the TNT studio show, on which O'Neal has served as an analyst alongside Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, and Ernie Johnson, since 2011 is widely considered the best studio show in sports television history, a program whose entertainment value exceeds its analytical value, and whose analytical value is itself considerable. The chemistry between O'Neal and Barkley, in particular, two enormous personalities with genuine friendship and genuine mutual willingness to embarrass each other, is the kind of television that cannot be manufactured or scripted, and that represents in its specific way the highest form of sports entertainment. His business career has been equally productive. He has been an investor and endorser across a range of industries: fast food franchises, real estate technology companies, fitness brands, with a commercial intelligence that has surprised people who assumed that the entertainment persona concealed a lack of business sophistication. He has a doctorate in education from Barry University, earned in 2012, which speaks to the specific determination to be taken seriously in intellectual contexts that has driven O'Neal's extra basketball career from the beginning. The combined value of his endorsement relationships, his media work, his investment portfolio, and his various business ventures is estimated to place him among the wealthiest former athletes in the world. This is not an accident. It is the product of 30 years of deliberate work, of understanding that the career in basketball was the foundation and not the limit of what he could build, of refusing to allow the end of his playing career to mean the end of his productive life. On November 7, 2013, Shaquille O'Neal was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame, the formal recognition of a career that had been recognized informally by every fan and analyst who had watched him play. The induction ceremony was as such ceremonies are an occasion for reflection and gratitude for the acknowledgement of the people who had contributed to what was being celebrated. But the period around the induction was also marked by something considerably less celebratory. The death of Jerome Crawford, one of O'Neal's closest friends and a constant presence in his life across decades, hit him with the specific force that the loss of long friendships always carries the loss not just of the person, but of the specific history that the friendship contained, the shared references and the private language, and the particular understanding that comes from being known by someone across time. O'Neal has experienced across his life the specific grief of losing people who were fundamental to his world: his grandmother, his uncle, close friends from various periods of his life, the broader community of people who had been present at the beginning and whose absence marks the passage from one phase of life to another in a way that success cannot adequately compensate for. He has also more publicly had to navigate the complicated feelings around his biological father, Joe Toney, the man whose absence shaped O'Neal's early life, and whose attempt to re-enter that life as his son became famous required a kind of emotional negotiation that O'Neal has not always found easy. The relationship between absent fathers and successful sons is one of the oldest stories in American life, and Shaquille O'Neal's version of it is neither simple nor resolved. It is the story of a man who chose not to define himself by an absence, but who has never been entirely free of the wound it created. Before the cancer announcement that shocked the world, Shaquille O'Neal had been navigating a series of health-related issues that were not publicly discussed in detail, but that represented the ordinary accumulation of physical costs that a career of the kind he had pursued inevitably produces. Professional basketball, particularly the kind of basketball that O'Neal played, which was physically more brutal than almost any other style in the game's history, is not kind to the body over time. The knees, the hips, the back, the feet, all of these load-bearing structures take on a burden across 19 seasons of NBA competition that the human body was not designed to absorb indefinitely. O'Neal had undergone various surgeries during and after his playing career to address the specific damage that decades of elite competition had produced. He had also, in the years since his retirement, spoken openly about the challenges of managing his weight and maintaining the conditioning that had been, during his playing years, his professional responsibility, and that became in retirement a matter of personal health and discipline, without the external accountability structure that an NBA season provides. He had committed publicly and with characteristic self-awareness to taking these challenges seriously, understanding that the same body that had allowed him to be dominant in professional sports for nearly 2 decades required in its post-professional life the kind of sustained attention that health maintenance demands. The cancer diagnosis arrived in this context, not a body that had been neglected, but a body that had been worked to its limits for decades, and that was now presenting a challenge of a different kind. The specific circumstances of how Shaquille O'Neal's cancer diagnosis became public knowledge are in some ways as important as the diagnosis itself, because they speak to something corrosive about the relationship between celebrity and privacy in the contemporary media environment. The rumors had begun circulating before O'Neal chose to say anything. The internet, which functions in its worst expressions as a machine for converting private pain into public content, without the consent of the people experiencing that pain, had generated speculation and gossip and wild theories about his health, about changes in his appearance, about canceled appearances, about a dozen different possible explanations for things that the people doing the speculating had no actual information about. Shaquille O'Neal is not a person who would naturally choose to make a medical diagnosis public in the way it was made public. He is underneath the enormous public persona, a man who values privacy, who has drawn clear lines between the parts of his life that belong to his public career and the parts that belong to himself and his family. The cancer was not a performance opportunity. It was not content. It was a private medical fact that he and his family were in the process of absorbing, and that he was not ready to make available for public consumption. The internet did not permit this. The speculation became loud enough and specific enough that the choice was no longer between sharing and not sharing, but between sharing on his own terms and having the information managed for him by people who had no right to manage it. He chose to speak, he made the video, he said what was true and kept private. What he chose to keep private, the specific type, the stage, the clinical details that are his to share or not share as he decides. He expressed the desire to handle this privately, the wish that he had been permitted to do so, and the gratitude for the love that the people who actually knew and cared about him expressed in response. The response from his community was everything that the speculative internet rumor mill was not warm, genuine oriented toward the person rather than the content. Snoop Dogg's comment, simple, direct, carrying the weight of decades of genuine friendship, was everything that celebrity culture at its best can produce. Charles Barkley's tribute acknowledging the fighting spirit that has always been O'Neal's most fundamental characteristic was the comment of a friend who knows him, not a fan who consumes him. Across all of the chapters of Shaquille O'Neal's life, the championships and the divorces and the business ventures and the entertainment career and the health challenges and the cancer diagnosis, one thing has remained constant in a way that nothing else quite has: his commitment to his children. Shareef O'Neal has pursued a professional basketball career navigating the specific psychological challenge of sharing a surname with one of the greatest players in the history of the game, while being himself a good but not generationally exceptional player. His father's support has been visible and consistent, not the management of a legacy, but the genuine encouragement of a parent who wants his son to succeed on his own terms and understands that the only way to support that is to be present without overwhelming. His other children, Amira, Shakir, Mayara, and Miles, have grown up in the specific and complicated circumstances of being the children of one of the most famous people in the world, and O'Neal has spoken about the challenge of providing them with normalcy, with the sense that they are people, rather than extensions of a brand, while also giving them the access to opportunity that his success makes available. The divorce from Shawnee Nelson restructured the family, but did not by O'Neal's account diminish his commitment to being present and engaged. He has attended games, graduations, performances, and the ordinary occasions that constitute the texture of children's lives with a consistency that speaks to the specific kind of fatherhood he was determined to provide, the kind that his own childhood's most significant absence had taught him to value. In the cancer announcement video, one of the things he referenced was his desire to handle the situation in a way that protected his children, to be the parent who managed this with dignity rather than the celebrity whose medical crisis became entertainment that his children would have to navigate alongside their own emotional response to their father's illness. This is who Shaquille O'Neal is underneath everything else: a father first determined that his children will have something he did not have, and determined to provide it even when the circumstances make provision difficult. There is something about the specific image of Shaquille O'Neal, the 7'1" frame, the 325 pounds of muscle, the physical presence so overwhelming that NBA arenas were designed around it, the force of personality that has dominated every room he has entered for 30 years, that makes the cancer diagnosis feel particularly wrong. Not more wrong than it would be for anyone else. Because cancer does not respect physical stature or personal magnetism or the specific kind of toughness that has characterized O'Neal's approach to every challenge of his life. But it feels somehow contradictory, the intrusion of something fragile and microscopic into a life that has been defined by the enormous and the overwhelming. This is the lesson that illness teaches, and that it teaches particularly well to people who have spent their lives operating from a position of physical dominance. That the body, however extraordinary, has limits that no amount of will or discipline or competitive spirit can override. That the things that make someone great at what they do, the physical gifts, the competitive ferocity, the refusal to accept defeat, are not adequate to every challenge. That some challenges require something other than the qualities that have brought you to the place where the challenge found you. O'Neal understands this. He has, by his own account, always understood it. His stepfather's military discipline instilled in him early the lesson that genuine strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to keep functioning in the face of it. He is vulnerable now in a way that 30 years of professional dominance and commercial success did not prepare the public to see him. And yet, he is also by every indication still himself, direct, determined, unwilling to perform emotion he does not feel or strength. He does not have clear about what matters and what does not. He wanted to handle this privately. He was not permitted to. And so he handled it publicly with as much of the dignity and directness that is his nature as the circumstances allowed. In any accounting of what Shaquille O'Neal has meant to American popular culture across the past 30 years, to basketball, to entertainment, to the specific intersection of athletic greatness and cultural personality that very few athletes have ever navigated as successfully, the cancer diagnosis does not diminish the achievement. It contextualizes it. He won 4 NBA championships. He was named Finals MVP 3 times. He won the regular season MVP award in 2000. He was named to 15 All-Star teams. He was selected to 8 All-NBA first teams. He won the NBA scoring title twice. He was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. He is, by the consensus of the people who study and analyze the game, one of the 5 most dominant players in the history of professional basketball. He also built outside the sport an entertainment and business career that has shown more creativity and more commercial success than almost any other athlete of his generation. The television work, the business ventures, the investment portfolio, the doctorate, the genuine intellectual engagement with ideas and causes beyond his immediate commercial interests, all of these speak to a man who understood from early in his career that basketball was the beginning and not the limit. And he has been across all of this a father imperfect by his own admission, as all fathers are but committed and present, in the specific way that his own childhood taught him to value above almost everything else. The cancer is not the end of this story. The cancer is in the long arc of a life this full and this consequential one more chapter, difficult, frightening, requiring the specific courage that has nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with character. Shaquille O'Neal has been showing character since he was a child in Newark, New Jersey, learning what it meant to be different and to choose strength over victimhood. He has been showing it in every subsequent chapter of a life that has contained more than most lives, that has been lived more loudly and more visibly than almost any other life of his generation. There is a particular quality to the courage of someone who has been physically dominant for 30 years and who now faces something that physical dominance cannot address. It is not the courage of the untested. It is the courage of someone who has won and lost at the highest levels, who has experienced the specific loneliness of elite competition and the specific joy of collective triumph, who has built and lost and rebuilt, and who understands from 30 years of evidence that the capacity to keep going is something that exists independently of the circumstances that require it. Shaquille O'Neal is keeping going. He said so in the video that he made because The alternative, allowing the internet's speculation to become the narrative, was worse than the exposure. He said it with the directness and the calm and the understated determination that has been his signature in every important moment of his public life. The people who love him, and the number is large, spanning continents and generations and cultures that share almost nothing except having watched this man be extraordinary for 3 decades, heard him. They responded with the love he deserved. Snoop Dogg, Charles Barkley, the thousands of ordinary people who have been following his story since he was a 20-year-old first-round pick in Orlando, who have watched him win and lose and grow and grieve and build and fight and refuse, in every chapter to be smaller than who he actually is. The biggest man in the room is still standing. He is going to fight this the same way he has fought everything, loudly, honestly, with full commitment, and with the understanding that the people around him are part of the fight. We are watching. We are with him. And the smart money, as it has always been across 30 years of watching Shaquille O'Neal face whatever came at him, is on the big man.